great. So the session is being recorded. So if you want to say something off the record, please indicate that. So thanks for joining our session, and to Emily and Bernadette for organizing. I'm going to briefly introduce the session and the paper presenters, and then I'm going to actually play recordings of the presentations because we studiously followed Bernadette and Emily's advice to record in advance, just in case. And then Greg Distelhorst is going to take over and introduce our discussants and moderate the questions in the discussion. So just to introduce the broad theme of this session, by now we all are pretty much, I think, within LIRA, in agreement that outsourcing or workplace fissuring is really a central theme in employment relations. It's certainly become a big focus of research in our field. And a lot of this research focuses on the impact on pay and working conditions, or on trends of wage inequality, and particularly this difficulty of enforcing labor laws across subcontractors and vendors is an important theme. But the theme of this session, or the focus of this session, is really on the politics of outsourcing. And by this we mean how employers and unions are negotiating over outsourcing decisions, or really partnering around insourcing of work, as well as trying to have some influence and solidarity across the value chain, across with the subcontractors and the vendors working with those core unionized firms. So we're interested in how outsourcing affects workers and how the negotiations with unions affect workers here, but also how employers are strategically using outsourcing to try to gain concessions or intensify work or drive up stress, which is the focus of one of our papers, often based on benchmarking of costs and performance. So Ian Greer and I are both at Cornell University, and we've been studying these dynamics in the US and European telecommunications and auto industries since the mid-2000s. So we've seen some of the change over time, as well as a lot of continuity in the strategies of employers and responses of different unions. We're each presenting co-authored papers based on new research in the US. So Ian is presenting with Mathieu Dupuis from TELUQ in Montréal on union influence on insourcing decisions in the US auto industry. And I'm presenting with David Blatter from Cornell and Sean O'Brady from McMaster's in Toronto on using a database, a survey that we conducted with the Communication Workers of America on the impact of outsourcing on worker stress. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. Share computer sound.
Make sure you got Mathieu go first.
Yep. Okay, can you all see Mathieu? Yeah, okay.
My name is Mathieu Dupuis. I'm a professor in labor relations at TELUQ in Montreal, and I'm going to present this paper with my colleague Ian Greer from Cornell. So the paper name is Insourcing and Industrial Relation, Trade Unionists Incorporate Politics at 3 North American Automakers. I would like to thank Jeannie Doellgast for the invitation, but also all the commentators for hopefully their useful comments. So our point of departure was that since the crisis of 2008, there was a stop in the decades-long trend towards outsourcing by the Detroit 3 automaker. Since this stop, it also prompted what we call insourcing. So insourcing is bringing back externalized process and assets in-house, inside the core boundaries of firms. So we look at in-house part plan of the Detroit 3, past and present. We interview trade unionists and manager in plants in Michigan, Ohio, New York, Tennessee, as well in Canada also. Headquarters of corporation, GM and Ford, and also union, UAW, of course, Unifor, but also IUE in the Dayton area. So I'm going to present the main literature on insourcing and the methods, and Ian will do the findings. So why insourcing first happened? Insourcing happened against the backdrop of union decline and vertical disintegration. We know that since the 90s, there was a large union decline in the US parts industry, but also in the assembly sector. The second factor is vertical disintegration. So Detroit tree firms started to outsource massive parts of what they call non-core business, just as Delphi or Visteon. In Canada, the phenomenon was less severe because the Detroit tree never been as integrated as in the US. But still, there was a creation of a massive non-unionized supplier sector. Also, the 08 and 09 crisis prompted severe concession into the core of union presence in the sector. Meanwhile, insourcing started as a point of reference for the Obama administration during the crisis. Also, the terms reshoring started to appear in popular press as well as scientific literature. We did not observe any case of reshoring, but we did observe the reversal of domestic outsourcing. 4 types were identified, and Ian will talk a bit more about this, but the first one was insourcing of assets, so buying by a plant. The second one was insourcing of production, so bringing back work performed by an outside supplier to a plant that is inside the boundaries of the Detroit tree. Insourcing of support function, it's work done by a contractor, usually on site, that they bring back to be performed by the OEM's workers. Example, the maintenance work on machine or in the plant. And also in situ outsourcing, which is the phenomenon of allowing an external supplier to operate on site. So literature, the main question that guided our work is why insource? So we identified 3 main reasons in literature. The first one is cost and benefits, is the classical approach of mainly based on the transaction cost economics. So there's a cost and benefits of insourcing. So firm will do a make or buy calculation on why insource or not. Cost is important, but also control of certain aspect of the production process. The second one is management politics. So the insourcing decisions are not reducible to pure economic decision. There's also the influence of management ideology on what is to be performed inside firm's boundary or outside. The third one, is labor and management relationship. So it's mostly from the industrial relation literature. So partnership, but also union strategy influence the boundary of the firm. Joint programs or local experiments are really important in that regards. The example of Saturn is really silent. So our approach is not completely outside of these claims, but we mostly base our approach on local union politics and the relationship between the corporate center and the local plant. So methods, quickly, we were mainly based on an exploratory and qualitative investigation. We approached the field with an inductive methods because there was no preconceived or clear definition of insourcing or any empirical work in that regards. From 2016 and to 2018, we visited 23 plants in the US and Canada, mostly part plants, so spun-off plant, still possessed plant by the Detroit tree, but also former plant that were back in source. We mostly interview trade unionists at the local level, but also manager and regional trade unionists. And we guided our question on why their plant remained open during the wave of plant closure, what was the role of collective bargaining and change to pay, benefits, and work rules, as well as joint labor management effort to improve plant performance. and whether insourcing took place and how trade unionists were involved in putting together the business case, lobbying or bidding. So I'm going to pass to Ian for the next part.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure.
Okay. I'm now going to put up Ian's. And
Hi, everyone. My pleasure.
this is where the complication of screen sharing comes in. All right, share screen.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to present the empirical piece of this paper. I'm going to talk about what these insourcing cases were that we looked at and how trade unionists tried to make insourcing happen. So in many journalistic and policy discussions of insourcing, we hear about the movement of work from low-wage countries like China and Mexico to higher-wage countries like Canada and the US. This, however, is not what we observed in all of our visits to plants. Instead, we observed 27 cases of insourcing, and they were all domestic. So 8 of them were transfers of plants that had been spun off and repurchased by the OEMs. 8 of them were specific manufacturing processes like cutting pieces of metal or making axles, moving that from an external supplier into an OEM plant. 8 of them were taking work that were done by contractors to be done by the skilled trades, so insourcing of support services. And we had 3 cases of on-site outsourcing where work was done by contractors, but it was on the premises, it was unionized, but the pay and working conditions were worse than the core workers. So how did trade unionists try to make this happen? Well, the business case was really important. So there was a lot of discussion of risk, for example, and of cases like Delphi and American Axle, where the OEMs were basically held to ransom by large companies supplying strategic components. So avoiding this risk or mitigating this kind of risk was important. Another thing that people talked about a lot was the weakening case against insourcing from union wages and benefits and working conditions. So the business case for insourcing improved because of multi-tier wage structures, concessions and benefits that shifted costs and risks onto workers, and changes in work organization that made it more flexible from the perspective of management. But the business case did not make itself. It was very political. There was an important formal dimension to this. So both UAW and Unifor had language that created a structure for these discussions. So in the US, there are basically 2 kinds of language. There's contracting language for production and, contracting language for skilled trades and sourcing language for production. And both of these have been evolving since the 1990s that basically regulate how this cost calculation is made and what the role of trade unionists is in that cost calculation. There's also an important informal dimension where local trade unionists lobby for this work, where they make connections with purchasing people, product development people, engineering people in Detroit to figure out how they can get bids in to carry out the work to bring product into their plants. There's an important temporal dimension to this where trade unionists have to figure out how far in advance of the launch of a new product do we need to know that something is being developed so that we can bid for it. So lobbying was really important, and the connections made were beyond just the labor relations function and the local plant. They were national in scope. So I was very surprised that it was not a clear case of local labor management partnership to improve performance and bring work into plants this way. It had a strong national dimension, and it also, and leverage was really important. In fact, we had 6 cases where there was no labor management partnership strategy for insourcing at all. Instead, local unionists were finding ways to get local managers to do things that they kind of didn't want to do, using grievances and other pressure tactics. Leverage was also really important if you compare to help us compare the cases. So there were some cases where trade unionists didn't have any access at all to the sourcing process. And these were the ones that were outside of the collective agreements, of the master agreements of the UAW and Unifor with the big 3. They were outside either because the plant had been purchased by an independent part supplier and was now outside of the OEM master agreement for that reason, or because it was with a different union, like the International Union of Electrical Workers in the Dayton area. So many thanks. That's what we have, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay. So now, I'm going to move on to the next, the final presentation. Let's see here. Sorry, rookie mistake. I'm having trouble finding this video. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm presenting today with Dave Blatter from ILR and Sean O'Brady from McMaster University. Our paper looks at how outsourcing and offshoring of call center jobs affects workers. We're focusing on different measures of worker stress. We'll also talk briefly about union responses to outsourcing these jobs, which I think Nell Geiser from CWA will pick up in her comments. Our study is based on a survey of 2,066 call center workers in US call centers. All of these workers are in-house in workplaces spread across 8 different employers, and they're all covered by union agreements. We coded 24 different collective agreements and then matched this data with workers in each bargaining unit. And finally, we carried out interviews and focus groups with around 40 different union reps and shop stewards. So our first question concerns how outsourcing affects workers' experience of stress. And we test 2 different paths that we expect to connect outsourcing to stress. The first one is we expect workers to experience higher stress rates where they fear that they will lose their jobs as a result of outsourcing. And this is based on past research on worker responses to organizational restructuring and job insecurity, finding that job insecurity in particular increases stress. We also see in our own past research and in interviews that in the call center environment, outsourcing threats are not only implicit, the way in which organizational restructuring would be, but they're often used strategically by employers to put more pressure on workers. So, for example, one quote, they're threatening you with your job. If you don't agree to this list or that title, that they'll close down the center. Our second hypothesized path comes out of our interviews with union representatives primarily. So as we were talking to different union reps to set up the survey in the first place, they told us a major source of stress we should definitely include in the survey really had to do with members having to correct vendor errors and sometimes actual misconduct by vendors. So this could directly create more work for reps in tracing and correcting errors, but there was also a lot of stress associated with having to interact with angry customers whose calls had then been escalated to them, initially having been dealt with by vendors. So this also connects to past research showing that customer incivility through mistreatment of employees can increase stress and emotional exhaustion, with research done, for example, by Danielle Van Jaarsveld in this area. The one quote, when the language barrier is bad, then the customer gets mad and calls again to speak to someone in the US. They're really pissed. Our reps are usually the last line of defense and have to take all the heat that comes with the customer. And here are some descriptive findings from our survey. Close to 80% of the workers surveyed felt that it was likely there would be layoffs at their call centers associated with outsourcing and offshoring. But we did find differences by employer and bargaining unit. For example, ranging at one employer, only 19% of the workers had these fears, whereas in the higher end, 87% at another employer had those fears. So it shows that there is some variation. We also found that 67% and up to 80% in some employers reported that these layoff threats have been used to actually justify changes in management practices. So this speaks directly to that pressure that workers and their unions are under as a result of benchmarking connected to outsourcing. I'm not going to go over this chart as we have limited time. This basically shows the measures that we're using in our analysis. It also tries to illustrate some correlation between the level of stress that workers feel and their experience of dealing with errors and misconduct by vendors, as well as fears associated with outsourcing and offshoring of calls.
All right, so we conducted some statistical analysis on the data we obtained from the survey in order to test the two hypotheses that Jenny just covered. So the analysis we conducted was a structural equation model, or SEM. So SEM is a technique that builds off of regular regression models, but allows us to test larger models of many relationships between variables rather than just looking at one dependent variable. So it's a theory-driven technique. So you build a model based off your theory, and then you test that model to see how well it fits the actual data. We use SEM mostly because it allows us to test multiple avenues of effect at the same time. So we can test both hypotheses of fear of outsourcing and customer abuse at the same time, and it also allows us to explore indirect and mediated effects in a way that regular regression analysis does not. So our model begins very simply. We have two measures of worker stress, emotional exhaustion and sleep troubles. Both these are taken from other literature on worker stress and are comprised of multiple questions. And then we have fear of layoffs due to outsourcing or offshoring. So we hypothesize that this fear of layoffs leads to increased emotional exhaustion and sleep troubles. But layoff fears don't happen in a vacuum. So workers fear layoffs more when they have to deal with actual outsourcing in the form of interactions with vendors that are doing work that could be or was done in-house. So we hypothesize that this leads to more fear, but that it also leads to increased vendor errors that workers must resolve or deal with. And then as outsourcing increases vendor errors, it also leads to increased customer abuse. So this customer abuse then will lead to increased emotional exhaustion and sleep troubles. So these are two paths to worker stress through outsourcing. You can see, if you can go to the next there, yeah, we can see that all of these are significant at the 1% level, confidence level. So they're highly significant statistically, but they also have significant impacts on worker stress. Also interesting to note is that customer abuse has almost twice the impact on emotional exhaustion as fear of layoffs does. So that if, as literature has done now, mostly focused on fear of layoffs, on worker stress, we're missing a big chunk of the effect that outsourcing can have on negative worker well-being and worker stress. The next slide just shows in more detail the robustness of our results across a series of tests and models. I won't get into this, but if people want to ask questions about statistics during questions, I'm happy to talk about this more.
Well, our current study examined the effects of outsourcing on employee well-being. Forthcoming research is investigating the effects of collective agreements on these dynamics. We noticed that there were many collective agreement provisions that related to outsourcing and its effects, and so we decided to include these in subsequent analyses. To do this, I coded collective agreement provisions from 24 bargaining units covered in the quantitative analysis. These provisions related to various aspects of call center work, such as performance management and scheduling practices. But of interest to this research, many related to outsourcing and its effects. I coded 3 types of provisions. First, I coded collective agreement provisions related to layoff protections, such as the right of a union to be consulted before firm layoff decisions. Second, I coded provisions on transfer rights. One example was that some agreements restricted employers from forcing their employees into new positions. Third, I coded collective agreements on the basis of whether they limited outsourcing in some form, such as the proportion of calls taken by third-party vendors, or by restricting it to certain positions. As we see on the charts and the slides, next slide, there is considerable variation in the presence of these provisions across bargaining units. Layoff protections and transfer rights ranged from being very strong to very weak, with some variance in between. Moreover, 25% of the bargaining units had contract provisions that limited outsourcing. Our initial plan was to investigate the effects of these provisions using regression analyses. Surprisingly, we found that the contract provisions actually were associated with worse outcomes for employees. We figured that the quantitative analyses could only take us so far, since this contradicted what we were hearing from union staff. Given the limits of quantitative analysis, we dug further through interviews and focus groups. These led us to 3 key observations. First, we discovered that agreement provisions were negotiated where outsourcing was more of a problem. This explained what our quantitative analysis couldn't capture. Even with strong provisions, outsourcing can be more damaging in firms that are more aggressive in its use. As mentioned earlier, this varies across workplaces. Second, having provisions doesn't necessarily mean that there is compliance. Many employers negotiated strong provisions, but sometimes there were critical loopholes or managers on the ground did not comply. Third, given the limits of the collective agreements, we found that strong union support was crucial to reducing stress in workplaces associated with negative customer interaction and threats to job security. This refers to the day-to-day work of shop stewards, who does, for example, discussing work arrangements with managers or initiating local campaigns to incentivize better management practices. To sum it up, our research has identified that outsourcing matters to stress and identifies multiple pathways to explain its effects. We also found some evidence which suggests that collective agreements and union actions make a difference. Speaking of unions, up next is Nell Geiser, who will explain the CWA's experience with these issues.
All right, so those are the presentations, and I'm going to turn it over to Greg, who's going to briefly introduce Nell and Stan. And then he's going to handle the questions from now on.
Sounds good. Yeah, really great research presentation. So we're really privileged to have 2 discussants from the labor movement able to comment on these papers. I'm really pleased about that. We're going to start with Nell Geiser. Nell is the Director of Research for Communication Workers of America, representing 700,000 workers in the private and public sectors, including 40,000 call center workers. So Nell's comments, I think, will be really appropriate and helpful to this. And then second, I'll introduce Stan before your comments. So Nell, please take it away.
Great, thanks. Really glad to be here. Thanks, Sean, Ginny, and David. We really appreciate partnering with such committed scholars to develop powerful evidence about the impacts of stress in call centers, and we're using the findings to strengthen our bargaining and advocacy. I'll touch on 3 points of context to help ground the survey findings. First, what are the employer strategies to shrink the union out of existence that are the source of job loss fears and are also directly tied to the customer abuse stress? Second, what are the negotiated protections CWA has won to restrict call center outsourcing? And third, I'll describe our ongoing efforts to build global solidarity relationships to counter the race to the bottom and the divide and conquer strategies of employers. So in terms of the context of outsourcing fears, the majority of our call center membership is in telecom, with also some in airlines and public sector. And across the board, we can see, of course, the impacts of neoliberal corporate strategies to shift liability and costs outside the firm while keeping profits inside the firm. And this fissuring also functions as a union avoidance strategy. In telecom, like in many other concentrated sectors, there's multiple strategies employers use to undermine and diminish the union workforce. Of course, the first is to outsource as much work as possible. This happens across call centers, technician work, and in wireless retail stores contracted to third-party dealers. I won't go into the details of all the outsourcing strategies and how it gets around collective bargaining agreements, but happy to answer questions. And it's often the rationale is to shift work to lower paid contractors to meet business needs of various kinds, and that's the loophole. I do want to mention that the trade-off between transaction costs and control are definitely present in these decisions around call centers, and telecoms are motivated to keep some high-value sales and service tasks in-house, but wage differentials are really dramatic and prevent us from making any real economic case for bringing work back in-house. So like for union call center agents, depending on employer, and there are some two-tiered within employers, two-tiered wages that we've had to negotiate. So that ranges from $20 to $40 an hour in union call centers versus 10 to 15 an hour in domestic vendors, and around $2 an hour in the Philippines and India, and even lower in some regions of those countries. Another key strategy, moving on from outsourcing, is of course keeping the union out of burgeoning areas of the business where future job growth will be, like information technology, software, media. Third, create job titles that are outside of the bargaining unit because they are allegedly management or otherwise outside the purview of the bargaining unit. We're in legal fights about that all the time, grievances and in court. Finally, if you can't force people to leave or lay them off, just wait and watch the higher paid bargaining units shrink through attrition. Of course, this happens. This is happening at all of our telecom employers. So turning to the negotiated protections that we have won over the years to preserve union jobs in call centers, I'll focus on restrictions on outsourcing that attempt to establish union jurisdiction over the work, preventing that attrition of the bargaining unit. So first of all, the older wireline telecom contracts have stronger protections in some cases, with a guarantee, for example, of up to 75% of customer calls going to union represented centers at Verizon, a similar share in CenturyLink, and some units at Frontier Communications. All operators have sought in recent years to shrink and close the wireline call centers, allegedly due to the decline in the landline business, even as new broadband services and wireless bring in a steady stream of new customers. So this ties to Sean's point about older shops that are more vulnerable to outsourcing have also negotiated stronger protections, but the employer finds workarounds. Then you look at the wireless side of the business, the main growth driver. We only represent one wireless carrier. There's only one union wireless carrier in the US, that's AT&T Mobility, which CWA organized between around 1995 and 2003 across the country. The AT&T Mobility call centers first won anti-outsourcing protections just after this stress survey was completed, so in early 2018. So now we have a guaranteed percentage of calls going to represented workers in all 4 of the mobility contracts. And this standard was established following the first ever nationwide strike of AT&T wireless workers in May of 2017, which was a transformative experience for the workers involved and certainly points the way forward to win stronger protections and build back the power of the union. And finally, I'll talk about CWA's efforts to build global solidarity to combat divisions and take on global private capital. Now, the issue of blaming vendors for mistakes and fraud and other problems that customers experience is definitely a fraught one. We don't want to blame the frontline workers, obviously, and CWA members largely understand this is a systemic problem. But there's also issues of racism, nativism, defensiveness of US jobs that have led some workers, union workers, to blame, quote, the Philippines for the loss of good jobs when they see their managers going to train replacements in Manila. It's also, but it's important context that we try to share, and I think members are very aware of, that a large share of the outsourced call center operations are domestic, are in the US, and we've seen a downward pressure on wages due to the rise of business process outsourcing firms in the US over the past 10 to 15 years, about a 3% downward trend in overall call center wages. So what we've done is we've partnered with worker organizations in the Global South, and it's been extremely valuable in expanding our collective consciousness and developing new strategies to take on the economic violence of outsourcing. In the Dominican Republic, we supported the union Fedotrazzonas to win an organizing rights agreement with Teleperformance, which is the second largest business process outsourcing call center operator in the world, and a vendor for AT&T, and that's how we leveraged support for them through pressuring AT&T. In the Philippines, we were contacted during the 2016 Verizon strike by members of the BPO Industry Employees Network, BN, which is a worker organization in the call center sector that has sought to organize unions and is really a great network dedicated to a larger labor and social movement. And we've had worker delegations back and forth and done solidarity actions with each other. And then we're also supporting a Mexican organizing network that is active in call centers there. So it's been, very important to us as a union to reassert our investment in global solidarity through financial support as well as solidarity. And we have the Eduardo Diaz Fund, Solidarity Fund, and we passed a resolution at our 2019 convention reasserting our commitment to global solidarity. So that's been really rewarding, important work that the union is continuing now. And I think I'll end my comments there.
No, thanks so much. For our second discussant comments, we have Stan Sorscher. Stan had a 20-year career working as a physicist for a big employer where I grew up in the world at Boeing, followed by a second 20-year career for, let me get the name right, the Society of Professional Engineering Employees in Aerospace, and a union representing 20,000 engineering employees. Seeking attention, Stan, please take it away.
Dan, I think you're
Stan, you're muted still. Gotta hit you.
My thing just told me that, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. This has been a great session. I've enjoyed the conference so far. As Greg pointed out, I'm an activist and an organizer, so that's my perspective in reading the papers. I understand academic perspective is different, which means I may not be well qualified to offer advice or suggestions about the papers per se, but I'll try and put what I've read and heard into a larger perspective, which I hope will be useful to everyone. When Mathieu introduced the circumstances in the automobile industry in the United States and Canada, he mentioned declined union membership, vertical disintegration, and more reliance on non-union supplier sectors. I think of that in terms of power relationships, and all those things really represent a systemic effort, a strategic effort to give more leverage to large employers and less market power, less bargaining power to workers. So the power becomes, the goal is to concentrate power for the OEMs who supply, who control their supply chains. again, as an organizer, I see that again when Mathieu and Ian referred to the political dimension, to decisions about outsourcing and insourcing. That's my overwhelming experience when we engaged with management about outsourcing decisions. They're superficially concerned with transaction costs. They're really making strategic decisions. So I saw a similar theme in the paper by the other paper, Ginny, Dave, and Sean on call centers. The experience, you just get the experience from listening to the presentation. The workers are threatened. They feel threatened with outsourcing, cost cutting, work speed ups, and they're told to solve problems that come from their vendors without resources, authority, or opportunity to coordinate with their suppliers. Is exactly our experience in the aerospace industry. And it was explained to me by financial analysts and business people and journalists that this is intrinsic to the supply chain management business model. And a little darker interpretation is that all stakeholders should feel isolated, precarious, and at risk. And they should see other stakeholders as rivals, not partners. Kind of got that feel from Nell's discussion. And the whole idea is that psychologically and in terms of power relationship, this puts the dominant stakeholder in position to extract gains from all the subordinate stakeholders. That's the whole idea. And then is interesting, Ian mentioned that when OEMs lose that leverage, that's an opportunity to insource, right? If there isn't anybody to take advantage of, you might as well bring the work back. I thought that was kind of ironic. I hadn't thought of that. So our instinct in the labor movement is to solve problems with contract language. That's what we do, collective bargaining. Sean mentioned layoff and recall protections. Nell talked about this too, the transfer and bumping rights and the opportunity to offer alternatives to management, to engage. Ian made an interesting point in his video that engaging with management is less effective at the local level and more productive at the national level. I think there's some insight in that. I mentioned pressure tactics and leverage. So it isn't a matter of a business model or a business case. It really comes back to the power relationships. And Mathieu gave a good example of that too in the bailout in 2008. Here was an opportunity for President Obama to shift power and assert values. I would say a missed opportunity, but there it is. I mean, that was as good a opportunity as we had seen for a long time, and it points to it's a point of emphasis. Collective bargaining is what we do, but it only has so much potential, and there's a lot more potential in organizing and coalition building and the political dimensions of this. So the problem with incremental change in the collective bargaining is that it's basically harm reduction. Harm reduction accepts the basic rules, the basic power relationships, the unfavorable power relationships. And with harm reduction, the best you can do is reduce harm. And this is the nature of politics, right? As an organizer, I was taught always to think about reframing the issue and looking at the power relationships. If that's working, then harm reduction suddenly gets very, very simple, very easy. It's a consequence of reframing it. So, historically, we're at a magic moment here after 40 years of this neoliberal market solutions, shareholder-centric business models. It's finally becoming apparent that this leads to inequality, contributes to climate change, the racial divisions that we see. Everything is kind of adding up to the fact that this is the time when we should be making fundamental change. I know that's not the point of these papers, but again, that's the larger context that I think about that. And Nell's point about building solidarity, I think that's basically it. We have to think in terms of rehabilitating a social contract, reframing our values as a country, re-legitimizing the role of public policy, industrial policies, investments, and a complete rethinking of our approach to globalization. So that's the paper I would have written. And that's kind of the lens that I'm looking at or listening when I hear these papers.
Stan, thanks so much. So, before I turn it back to the research presenters, would anyone else like to pose a question to either the presenters of research or to our two discussants, who obviously have a lot of a really valuable perspective here as well? Any hands anywhere?
There's one question in the comments for Nell from Janet Wilder. I don't know if Janet wants to just ask the question.
Yeah.
Sure. Hi, I represent hospital workers in Massachusetts, and we've definitely seen all of our call center workers have gone home during COVID. And I'm just wondering if you have any sense of what, and it looks like they may stay home for quite a while. And I'm wondering if you have any sense what impact that will have on employers' desire to contract out. Will it make it easier because it's harder to have union solidarity when all your members are at home? Will they be able to save money on rent so there's less pressure to outsource? Just wondering if you've had any experience with work from home and call centers.
Yeah, that's definitely a critical question for us. Our default has been to oppose work from home in the past because it diminishes union power and the ability of workers to organize with each other. However, of course, during the pandemic, we immediately negotiated agreements as quickly as possible to move as many people home as possible. And that did work well with all of our major employers. And now going into bargaining with one of the larger ones that wants to talk about work from home potentially more permanently that we have not entertained before. There's a lot of concern, but also trying to think about it in a nuanced way about how it could also help worker members who might be outsourced from other, closures, even in retail that are happening, to be able to continue to work for the employer if there's more virtual work. So there's pros and cons from our perspective. Definitely pros from the public health standpoint, but a lot of cons and questions. So I think so far, in answer to your question, the main consideration that we have in trying to navigate that is the diminishing of union and worker power that we've seen in the past, where certain units that have been moved to work from home or where we've organized people working from home, it's just a lot harder to maintain that connection. So that's, but we don't have, great examples yet where it's going to be good for insourcing or anything like that. Maybe we'll get there, but right now the main concern is preserving union access, and there's a lot of ideas about how to do that, but it's challenging.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nell. Why don't we take it back to the research presenter? So Mathieu or Ian, one of you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Stan mentioned that maybe we're in this magic moment where workers stand up and challenge neoliberalism, this way of life and organizing society where we carry out our lives, our activism, our work in the service of the market. There's some evidence, not that we studied in our study to support that in the auto industry. There's a big strike at General Motors. You go to the picket line and you find out that the thing that people are really angry about is the multi-tier pay structure. This is something that was negotiated in order to be competitive and to keep jobs in a situation where there's tough, low-cost, non-union competition domestically. But on the other hand, what we saw, I mean, really what they're negotiating is, so there are investment guarantees where they manage to keep plants open. So that's an important thing that gets negotiated at the national level. That's really important, creating incentives for insourcing. And the other thing that is going on is contracting and sourcing language. And these are procedures through which trade unionists can make the business case. So, I mean, Stan has a point when he says it's about power relations. It's not about the business case. The sourcing decision is not based mainly on some kind of rational economic calculus. It's political. On the other hand, in our study, what is, so trade unionists who have a certain amount of leverage, what they do is they try and make a business case. So the business case is really important, is a really important starting point in how trade unionists make insourcing happen. And sometimes they make it in the context of a labor management partnership, and sometimes they make it in the context of some kind of struggle that is not a partnership. So yeah, many thanks for the really great presentations and comments. I really appreciated that. Thanks.
Yeah, if I can pick up on what Ian said and the two commentators, there's maybe a time also with COVID-19 which allocation of production might be more contested, and I wonder if our two commentators could grapple this question of, because we did not add any case of reshoring. Most of which study was really local sourcing, whether it's national or it's local. So outside contractors doing job inside a plant that you make the business take and you bring back the work inside. So I've been reading through some international organization they say, yeah, COVID-19 will change value change allocation. So I wonder if our two trade unionists will have the same opinion that the OECD or World Economic Forum on this question. So,
Stan, do you want to?
Can you rephrase that? I'm not sure I followed that question. I often misunderstand questions, and so I just want to make sure I have yours right.
Not complicated. So there's some international organization that say COVID-19 will be an opportunity to reframe the value chain to have more regional, like NAFTA or European Union. Yeah. So it will be an occasion to reshore production. In our paper, we did not add any case of reshoring. It was mostly local shoring, so local insourcing, sorry. So I wonder if you have the same analysis that these organizations have, that the restructuring of value chain could bring back more job into a regional setting.
Sure, that's my dream come true, of course, is to have a different approach to globalization that would be completely different from the one we have now. And instead of encouraging, the whole point of the neoliberal trade policy is to merge, is global economic integration, merge our domestic economy into the global economy, blur national boundaries, blur national interests. This can't be good for workers. There's nothing to the advantage of workers here. This is a huge advantage to companies who want to weaken all their stakeholders, right? This is really designed to maximize the interests of shareholders. So when the COVID pandemic came up and the WTO and the OECD said, well, we won't enforce any of the trade rules against public policies about COVID, they were really confessing that they put investor interests far above any public interest. You have to get, public interest has to be at the level of a pandemic before they will acknowledge that these are distorted power relationships. So I don't think of that as an accomplishment. I think of it as a confession. I don't think we've gained anything here. They've said that they're not going to enforce, you know, a dispute settlement or whatever. Again, I don't see that action as encouraging more insourcing. I see that action in the context of a larger recognition that we're going to rethink our global policies on globalization. That larger rethinking of globalization will be part of the context where we'll see more insourcing. So I think as the reliance on global economic integration disappears, we will see more national strategies, more industrial strategies, more manufacturing strategies. We'll stop blaming China for having an industrial policy and we'll start thinking about it more. We'll stop blaming Germany and Japan and Korea for having industrial policies and we'll start thinking about it more. So this really represents sort of the decline. To me, that statement about the pandemic represents the political opportunity to start thinking about an alternative to the neoliberal approach to globalization, and that alternative will include reindustrializing the domestic economies of the United States and Canada and UK and other countries that have really seen a lot of their industrial capacity be outsourced.
Just quickly make a point that I think Nell will might pick up on in response to this, and that's that one of the problems around outsourcing is particularly domestic outsourcing in the US is that so many of these subcontractors are not organized. Certainly that's the case in call centers, right? Where you have, you know, the organized core and the disorganized periphery. It's not that way in all countries, particularly in Europe. And I see a lot of what the CWA is doing right now and organizing BPOs and trying to bring attention to how much worse they're doing on COVID protections compared to the organized call centers as one tool also for organizing that domestic call center industry, even though that might be a very long in the future goal.
Yeah, let's just put them all out of business, those BPOs. Yes, I mean, I would say, yes, we've called out bad actors among non-union call center operators in the US where workers reached out about horrible working conditions during the pandemic, the inability to work from home. But what I wanted to really point to in the global context in the globalization of services is a deregulated sort of no framework reality of how in the Philippines, as I think a really important case in point, the BPO Industry Association really has a lot of free rein to operate without restrictions of labor law, without paying much tax in the Philippines. And during the pandemic, we've seen that call centers in the Philippines, because of the emergency quarantine there, they couldn't operate in business as usual, even because most people couldn't work from home because of inadequate internet connections, and then there's no public transit either, the way that Duterte has enforced the quarantine. So the BPOs have really faced a challenge in operating, but what it goes to show is that they're both complicit with the Duterte regime in benefiting from the you know, export-oriented economy that has been developed there, while also now kind of pushing back and saying, we don't like aspects of how the quarantine has been done. And so it's creating tensions between the industry and the government, and it's showing the US corporate sector that they can't rely on these outsourced markets to be reliable, you know, to be a reliable source of call center services during a time like this, which will become increasingly our reality. So it is opening up a lot of uncertainty about the future of the global call center sector And I think in some ways we have to see that as an opportunity to reframe and put workers' rights and voices at the center of what's wrong with the picture. So it's not necessarily a formal change from an international trade context, but more so the interactions between international global capital and particular governments, where we're going to see the opportunity to potentially push back and change the dynamics.
Thanks. You know, we're technically at time, but I want to give one final chance for Dave or Sean to make any comments before we close down the session. No, shaking heads, impassive faces. Sean, unmuted.
I guess one thing I'll say that would be surprising in relation to the discussion is Stan had picked up a point on a point that Ian had mentioned about the importance of a national approach to resistance. And I thought it was interesting for, in our case, I think I would say our findings contradicted that to some extent, because when you think of a country like the United States, where the labor regulatory regime has a lot of weaknesses, we saw that what local union people did locally actually mattered a lot. So for example, where the collective agreements weren't enough to enforce better protections for workers, we saw that, the people locally, they were doing a lot of things outside of the collective agreement to negotiate informally special arrangements with respect to outsourcing and these types of things. And these mattered a lot as well. And also other types of protections, which we didn't get to, but there's one campaign, for example, a local had bad management practices campaigns, where they're actually giving out pamphlets to workers and shaming certain managers for, treating workers in certain ways in context of outsourcing. And it's just to say that one thing I thought was interesting from our case was the importance of local ingenuity in that respect. And I know we're out of time, so I won't expand on that further.
Yeah, thanks for respecting that. Well, thanks to our presenters and especially to our two discussants. It was a great conversation today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.